To wrestling fans in 2025, the idea of one organization controlling virtually every professional wrestling promotion across North America, Japan, Mexico, the Caribbean, and parts of Europe sounds like something out of a dystopian novel. But for nearly 3 decades, that was the reality. The National Wrestling Alliance was the single most powerful entity in the history of professional wrestling. A cartel of promoters who divided up the entire continent into territories, who controlled who wrestled where, who held the championships, who got pushed and who got buried. And if you crossed them, if you tried to go it alone, if you dared to promote a show in their territory without permission, you would be destroyed. Not figuratively, sometimes literally. For most of its existence, the National Wrestling Alliance operated like a well-oiled machine. The territories cooperated. The world champion traveled from region to region like a king making rounds through his kingdom. Money flowed, fans packed arenas, and the men at the top of the pyramid got rich while maintaining an iron grip on the entire industry. But in 1975, cracks started forming in that machine. It was the year the National Wrestling Alliance started dying. Most people just did not realize it yet. And in this video, we are going to break down everything that went wrong, every crack, every failure, every short-sighted decision and festering problem that turned 1975 into the beginning of the end for the most powerful organization professional wrestling had ever known. By the time we are done, you will understand exactly why the territory system that had dominated wrestling for a generation was already on borrowed time. But to understand what went wrong in 1975, you first need to understand the man who had been holding the whole thing together. Because when he walked away, everything changed. Sam Muchnick was born in Ukraine in 1905 and emigrated to the United States as a child, settling in St. Louis, Missouri. He grew up to become a sports writer, covering the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team and developing connections with everyone from Babe Ruth to Al Capone. Eventually, he transitioned from writing about sports to promoting professional wrestling, and in 1948, he co-founded the National Wrestling Alliance alongside a handful of other promoters who shared his vision of a unified professional wrestling industry. By 1950, Muchnick was elected president of the NWA, and for the next quarter century, with a brief hiatus in the early 1960s, he was the most important man in professional wrestling, not because he was the flashiest, not because he was the most aggressive, but because he was the most trusted. In an industry built on lies and deception, where double crosses were as common as headlocks, Sam Muchnick was known as the honest wrestling promoter, the only one. The man who paid you exactly what he owed you, down to the last cent. The man who mediated disputes between promoters who would have happily stabbed each other in the back if left to their own devices. The man who somehow kept dozens of enormous egos pointed in the same direction for decades. His St. Louis territory was the gold standard. Conservative booking, credible matches, no blood and guts garbage, no outlandish gimmicks. Just solid, believable professional wrestling presented like a legitimate sporting contest. And he ran his annual cards at the Kiel Auditorium like a baseball promoter would run a pennant race, right down to shutting down for the summer so fans would not have to choose between wrestling and Cardinals games. For 25 years, Muchnick was the glue, the mediator, the diplomat, the one man everyone trusted. And in August 1975, at the NWA's annual convention, he told everyone he was done. He was not going to be president anymore. He had made up his mind, and there was no talking him out of it. After 25 years of settling disputes, managing egos, scheduling the world champion's appearances across dozens of territories, and keeping the peace between promoters who fundamentally did not trust each other, Sam Muchnick had simply had enough. The membership elected Fritz von Erich as the new president. Fritz von Erich, born Jack Adkisson, was the promoter of the Dallas territory. He was a former wrestler himself, a big man with a big personality who ran his territory with an iron fist. But Fritz von Erich was not Sam Muchnick, not even close. Where Muchnick was diplomatic, von Erich was domineering. Where Muchnick inspired trust, Von Erich inspired suspicion. Where Muchnick could walk into a room full of rival promoters and get them all nodding in agreement, Von Erich walked into rooms and made people wonder what angle he was working. The loss of Muchnick was catastrophic for the NWA in ways that would not become fully apparent for years. He was the one man who could pick up the phone and settle a dispute between two territories before it escalated into a promotional war. He was the one man who could convince a promoter to accept a booking decision he did not like, because everyone knew Muchnick was being fair. Without him, the alliance was a group of sharks circling the same waters with no one to keep them from eating each other. Think about what the NWA president actually had to do on a daily basis. You had to manage the scheduling of the world champion across dozens of territories, each of which wanted the champion on their biggest shows, and none of which wanted to share dates with anyone else. You had to settle disputes over talent. Wrestler X could be working in Georgia while Florida wanted him. Georgia said no. Florida threatened to pull its support from the next NWA convention bay. Now you had two promoters who were supposed to be allies ready to go to war over one mid-card wrestler. Multiply that by 30 territories, each with its own personality, its own ego, its own agenda, and you start to understand why Muchnick was so exhausted after 25 years that he walked away from the most powerful position in wrestling. The annual NWA conventions were described as contentious gatherings even in the best of times. Imagine a room full of men who each ran their own little kingdoms, men who were used to being the boss, men who controlled everything in their respective regions, all forced to sit at the same table and pretend they were equals. The politics were brutal. The backstabbing was constant. And the only thing that kept it functional was Muchnick sitting at the head of the table, using his reputation for fairness to keep everyone in line. Now that chair was empty, and the man sitting in it was Fritz von Erich, a guy whose own wrestlers would tell you he ran his Dallas territory like a personal fiefdom, pushing his own sons to the top of the card whether they deserved it or not. The NWA had traded a statesman for a warlord at the worst possible time. And that was just the beginning of the NWA's problems in 1975. While Muchnick was stepping down from the presidency, the man wearing the NWA World Heavyweight Championship belt was desperately trying to step away from it. Jack Brisco had been champion since 1973, and by 1975, he was running on fumes. Being the NWA World Heavyweight Champion was not like being champion in any other promotion. It was not a title you defended once a month on television. It was a lifestyle, a brutal, grinding, soul-crushing lifestyle that required the champion to live on the road 300+ days a year, traveling from territory to territory, defending the belt against the top star in each region. Ric Flair, who would hold the title years later, described working up to 8 matches a week during his time as champion. 8 matches. In different cities, in different states, sometimes in different countries. Jack Brisco was done with it. He told Muchnick directly that he had had enough of the worldwide schedule and wanted to be free of both the title and the relentless travel that came with it. The championship committee voted to transition the belt to Terry Funk, but the when and how still needed to be worked out. Now Brisco wasn't some weak-willed complainer who couldn't hack it. This was a 2-time NCAA wrestling champion from Oklahoma State. Lou Thesz himself called Brisco one of the toughest and most highly skilled wrestlers of the last 50 years. Don Leo Jonathan called him probably the greatest champion of the 20th century. This was a legitimate tough guy, a real athlete, a man who had earned every accolade the business had to give. And even he couldn't endure the punishment of being NWA World Champion indefinitely. That should have been a red flag for the entire alliance. If a man of Jack Brisco's caliber and toughness was being broken by the schedule, what did that say about the system itself? The NWA needed its world champion to be a Superman, to travel endlessly, wrestle nightly, maintain credibility in every territory, make every local star look good, without ever losing the belt except when the championship committee decided it was time for a change. It was an impossible job. And instead of recognizing that the model needed to evolve, instead of considering that maybe the champion did not need to hit every territory every month, the NWA just found the next guy and fed him into the same meat grinder. And this is where things got messy. The Funk family had been playing their own game behind the scenes. Dory Funk Jr. was originally supposed to challenge Jack Brisco for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship on December 10, 1975. At first, everything seemed locked in place. Dory was one of the most respected wrestlers in the business, a former world champion himself, and a major name within the National Wrestling Alliance. A title match involving him made perfect sense. But professional wrestling in the 1970s was full of moving parts, especially when it came to international tours and territory politics. At the time, Dory was already committed to a 3-week tour with All Japan Pro Wrestling, the company run by the legendary Giant Baba. Japanese wrestling was becoming an increasingly important business opportunity for American wrestlers, and those tours could be extremely profitable. Once Dory realized he would not be able to make the scheduled title match date, a replacement had to be found quickly. That replacement ended up being his younger brother, Terry Funk. On the surface, the situation looked simple enough. One brother could not make the match, so the other stepped in. Fans probably saw it as nothing more than a scheduling issue caused by international travel commitments. But behind the scenes, the situation was much more complicated than it appeared. There was already tension building between the Funk family and the leadership of the National Wrestling Alliance, and this incident only added fuel to the fire. The real issue centered around Terry Funk's involvement in arranging a deal for Jack Brisco to wrestle Giant Baba in Japan. Terry had helped put the agreement together himself, opening the door for the NWA World Champion to appear in All Japan Pro Wrestling. From a business perspective, it was a smart move. Matches involving the NWA champion in Japan attracted huge crowds and brought major financial opportunities to everyone involved. The problem was that Terry reportedly arranged the deal without properly consulting the NWA leadership beforehand. That was a serious issue because the NWA World Heavyweight Championship was not treated like an ordinary title. It represented the entire alliance of wrestling territories spread across the United States and beyond. Decisions involving the champion were supposed to go through the organization's leadership and promoters. Instead, the Funk family had acted first and worried about approval later. When Terry Funk defeated Jack Brisco at the Miami Beach Convention Hall on December 10, 1975, he became the NWA World Heavyweight Champion. He and Dory became the first brothers to both hold the title. It was a historic moment, but it was also a moment that highlighted a fundamental problem with the NWA. The championship committee existed on paper, but in practice, the title was being traded around based on backroom deals, family connections, and political maneuvering rather than any coherent long-term plan. And this was not just a problem at the top of the card. The ROT was everywhere. The NWA had been operating as an illegal monopoly since its founding in 1948, and everybody knew it. The Department of Justice had caught up with them in the 1950s, launching an investigation that resulted in the infamous NWA Consent Decree of 1956. The alliance was forced to sign an agreement acknowledging that they would not engage in monopolistic practices. They agreed to stop blacklisting wrestlers. They agreed to stop threatening promoters who tried to compete. They agreed to stop using their collective power to crush anyone who stepped out of line. And then they went right back to doing all of those things. By 1975, the NWA was still operating with the same strong-arm tactics it had used since its inception. Wrestlers who worked for promotions outside the alliance found themselves blackballed. Promoters who tried to run shows in NWA territory found their access to arenas mysteriously blocked, their television deals sabotaged, their top talent poached away. Threats of violence and physical retaliation were reportedly used against anyone who disregarded the territory system. The consent decree was a piece of paper. Nothing more. The NWA signed it, filed it away, and continued business as usual for the next 3 decades. And in 1975, this behavior was put on full display when the International Wrestling Association tried to challenge the NWA's dominance. The International Wrestling Association was the brainchild of television producer Eddie Einhorn and promoter Pedro Martinez. It was the first serious attempt at creating a truly national wrestling promotion, one that would break free from the territory model and compete directly with the NWA on a national stage. And here is the thing that made the IWA truly revolutionary. They offered actual contracts to wrestlers, written agreements with guaranteed minimum pay. In 1975, this was virtually unheard of. Wrestlers in the NWA territories were independent contractors who got paid per appearance. If a promoter decided he did not need you anymore, you were out. No severance. No notice. Nothing. The IWA was offering something better, something fairer. Something that treated wrestlers like human beings instead of expendable commodities. The NWA crushed them through a combination of talent raids, pressure on arena operators, manipulation of television deals, and the simple economic reality that the NWA could outspend and outlast any startup promotion. The International Wrestling Association was doomed to failure. It folded by the end of the year. The wrestlers who had been brave enough to sign with the IWA found themselves persona non grata in many NWA territories. Some careers were permanently damaged. Some guys never recovered. This was not an accident. This was deliberate policy. The NWA had been doing this to people since the 1950s. Jim Wilson, a wrestler who had the audacity to challenge the NWA's practices, found himself systematically blacklisted from every territory in the alliance. He ran unsuccessful competing cards in the Georgia territory, picketed NWA shows, and spent years railing against the corruption of the system. Wilson claimed that he once woke up to find his family's German Shepherd bludgeoned on the morning of an independent show he had organized in Atlanta. Whether that particular incident was connected to the NWA or not, the message was clear. If you went against the alliance, there would be consequences, and those consequences could extend well beyond your professional career. The NWA also had a long history of using violence and intimidation against anyone who threatened the status quo. Florida promoter Eddie Graham reportedly used his top wrestlers as enforcers, sending them to brutalize would-be independent promoters and convince them to stay out of NWA territory. There were documented cases of arena managers being pressured or bribed to refuse bookings from non-NWA promotions. Television stations were warned that if they aired programming from competing promotions, they would lose access to NWA talent. All of this was happening in 1975. All of it was a continuation of practices that had been going on for decades, and all of it was building a case file that would eventually be used against the NWA when the political and legal landscape shifted. And the NWA went right on operating as if nothing had happened. Because in 1975, they still had the power to do that. They could still squash any competitor like a bug and face no consequences. But what the NWA leadership failed to understand, what they could not see because they were too busy congratulating themselves on another successful territorial defense, was that the world was changing around them. Their monopolistic tactics, while still effective in 1975, were building a foundation of resentment and vulnerability that would eventually be their undoing. The IWA failed, yes, but the idea behind it, the concept of a national wrestling promotion that could reach audiences everywhere instead of being confined to a single region, did not die. It just went dormant. And when Vince McMahon Jr. picked it up a decade later, the NWA would not be able to stop him. Because by then, they had spent too many years making enemies and too few years adapting to the future. But the problems with the NWA in 1975 were not just structural and political. They were also happening inside the ring, in the very territories where the alliance made its money. St. Louis, the NWA's crown jewel, the territory that Sam Muchnick had built into the most respected wrestling market in North America, was getting hit with booking disasters that threatened to undermine everything he had worked for. On April 18, 1975, something happened at the Kiel Auditorium that produced what many insiders consider the worst fan reaction in St. Louis wrestling history. The details of what specifically went wrong on that card are less important than what it represented. St. Louis was supposed to be the gold standard, the place where wrestling was presented as a serious, credible athletic competition, where finishes made sense, and where the fans trusted the product because the product respected them. But that trust was being eroded. The previous year, the Sheik had come into St. Louis for a match against Pat O'Connor and turned it into a wild, out-of-control brawl that violated every principle Muchnick had established for his territory. Blood, weapons, chaos, everything that St. Louis was not supposed to be. Muchnick was reportedly furious. He turned to Pat O'Connor after the debacle and said words that would prove prophetic. "This is how you kill a great town." Earlier in 1973, there had been the Terry Funk incident during a television taping. Funk had won the Missouri Championship from Johnny Valentine using a steel chair in plain view of the referee, then locked in the spinning toe hold for the submission victory. It was everything you did not do in St. Louis. An over-the-top, blatantly illegal finish that shattered the territory's carefully maintained illusion of competitive legitimacy. When Muchnick arrived at the studio between tapings, fans swarmed him to voice their outrage. He was livid. The damage to St. Louis's reputation was real and lasting. These incidents might seem minor in isolation, but they pointed to a deeper problem. The NWA's member territories were becoming harder to control. Individual promoters and wrestlers were making decisions based on what got a reaction in the moment, rather than what protected the long-term health of the business. The cooperative structure that was supposed to ensure consistent quality across all territories was breaking down. Everyone was looking out for themselves, and the product was suffering for it. And then there was the Women's Championship mess. Sue Green defeated the Fabulous Moolah for the NWA World Women's Championship. She stood 6'1" and was a legitimate athlete, but her reign was disputed by the NWA itself, creating yet another situation where the alliance's claim to sanction unified world championships was undermined by its own internal politics. The NWA was supposed to be the authority that settled these kinds of disputes. Instead, it was creating them. Meanwhile, the broader landscape of the NWA was literally shrinking. Promotions were folding. The National Wrestling Federation, which had been founded in the late 1960s by Pedro Martinez as a rival to the NWA before eventually being absorbed into the system, went out of business in late 1975. The big-time wrestling title in Boston, which had been active since 1958 and had its own lineage tracing back to the disputed Edouard Carpentier Championship situation of the 1950s, ceased to exist. These were not major territories by 1975 standards, but every closure represented a contraction of the NWA's reach. Every time a territory folded, it meant fewer markets for the world champion to visit, fewer dues being paid into the alliance coffers, fewer allies to call on when an outsider tried to move into NWA-controlled territory. The Japanese situation added another layer of complexity. Giant Baba's All Japan Pro Wrestling had become an NWA member in 1973, and the relationship was valuable for both sides. The NWA got access to the lucrative Japanese market, and Baba got exclusive promotional access to the NWA World Champion whenever he toured Japan. But the relationship also created problems. In December 1974, Giant Baba convinced Jack Brisco to drop the NWA World Title to him for a week, while on tour in Japan. Baba held the championship from December 2nd to December 9th before losing it back to Brisco. This was done to generate excitement with Japanese fans and media, and it worked brilliantly for Baba's promotion. But not every NWA member was comfortable with the World Championship being used as a promotional tool for a Japanese promotion. There were grumbles. There were concerns about the title's prestige being diluted. In 1975, Antonio Inoki's New Japan Pro Wrestling also entered the picture, joining the NWA primarily to gain control of the NWA World Junior Heavyweight Championship. New Japan's relationship with the NWA would be sporadic and contentious over the next decade, with Inoki frequently butting heads with the alliance's leadership. The Japanese situation was becoming increasingly complicated, with multiple promotions vying for NWA recognition and the political dynamics of Japanese wrestling creating headaches that the NWA's North American-focused leadership was not equipped to handle. But perhaps the most insidious problem facing the NWA in 1975 was one that nobody could see yet. It had not fully arrived. It was coming, and when it did, it would destroy everything. Technology. In the latter part of 1976, satellite uplink transmission to cable companies would begin changing the landscape of television distribution. Even in 1975, the seeds were being planted. Videotape trading was becoming more common. Fans in one territory could, for the first time, get their hands on footage from other territories. And when they did, they started noticing something uncomfortable. The same angles were being run in different territories. The same finishes. The same storylines with different names attached. A heel who was a monster in Florida was doing the exact same act in Georgia with the exact same results. A babyface who triumphed over impossible odds in Texas was running the same program in the Carolinas. The magic trick only works if the audience does not know how it is done. Slowly, inevitably, the audience was starting to figure it out. The NWA's entire business model was built on regional isolation. Each territory produced its own television show that aired only in its own market. Fans in Memphis never saw what was happening in Portland. Fans in Dallas never saw what was happening in Atlanta. The World Champion's appearance was a special event specifically because fans could not see him every week on television. He was a mythical figure who appeared in your town a few times a year, defended the title against your local hero, and then vanished back into the ether. But that model depended entirely on keeping those audiences separate, on maintaining the illusion that each territory was its own self-contained universe. Technology was about to make that impossible, not all at once, not overnight, but steadily, relentlessly, and irreversibly. In 1975, Jim Crockett Promotions premiered a new syndicated show called Wide World Wrestling. It was one of several NWA territories beginning to push their television beyond traditional geographic boundaries. On the surface, this seemed like smart business. More television meant more exposure, which meant more fans, which meant more money. But it was also the beginning of the end. Once you started pushing your television into someone else's market, the regional isolation that the entire NWA system depended on started to break down. A fan in Virginia could now see what was happening in the Carolinas. A fan in Tennessee could see what was happening in Georgia. The more they saw, the more they noticed the repetition, the recycled storylines, the interchangeable characters. The illusion that their local territory was unique started to evaporate. Wrestling magazines of the era, publications like The Wrestler and Inside Wrestling, also contributed to this erosion. They ran features on stars from multiple territories side by side. A fan reading those magazines could see that the same feuds, the same angles, the same booking patterns were being used everywhere. The mystique was fading. The magic was being revealed, and the NWA had no plan to replace it with anything. The NWA leadership in 1975 showed no awareness of this impending disruption. They were focused on the same things they had always focused on: protecting territories, scheduling the champion, settling disputes between promoters, managing the political dynamics of the alliance. These were all important concerns, but they were yesterday's concerns. The future was coming, and the NWA was not ready for it. And this is where you start to see how all of these individual problems connected to form something larger, something fatal. Muchnick steps down, and the alliance loses its most capable leader at the worst possible time. Jack Brisco burns out, revealing that the grueling champion's schedule is unsustainable and that the title is being managed through political maneuvering rather than strategic planning. The IWA tries to offer wrestlers a better deal and gets crushed, but the idea of a national promotion does not go away. Territories are folding. Booking quality is declining. The women's championship is being disputed. Japan is creating complications, and technology is about to expose the fundamental flaw in the entire business model. Each of these problems was manageable on its own. The NWA had survived worse. It had survived the Department of Justice investigation. It had survived the departure of the Worldwide Wrestling Federation in 1963. It had survived the formation of the American Wrestling Association. It had survived a decade-long decline in wrestling's popularity throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. But this time was different, because this time the problems were not coming one at a time. They were all arriving at once, and the one man who might have been able to hold it all together, the one diplomat who had spent 25 years keeping the peace, had just walked away from the table. The NWA would continue to dominate professional wrestling for another decade after 1975. Georgia Championship Wrestling would become the first nationally broadcast wrestling program on cable television in 1979, giving the NWA huge visibility through TBS. Harley Race and Ric Flair would carry the World Championship with distinction. Individual territories like Mid-Atlantic, Florida, and Georgia would produce some of the greatest wrestling programming in history. But the structural weaknesses that became visible in 1975 never went away. They just got worse. The territories continued to act in their own self-interest at the expense of the collective. The monopolistic tactics continued to generate resentment and legal vulnerability. The champion's schedule continued to burn out whoever held the belt. And technology continued its relentless march toward making the regional model obsolete. When Vince McMahon Jr. finally pulled the trigger on his national expansion in 1983, taking the World Wrestling Federation out of the NWA for good and beginning his systematic dismantling of the territory system, the NWA's response was exactly what you would have predicted based on everything that went wrong in 1975. It was disorganized. It was fractured. It was every man for himself. The promoters could not agree on a unified strategy because they had never truly trusted each other. They could not adapt to the new television landscape because they had spent decades depending on regional isolation. They could not offer wrestlers better deals because they had spent generations treating talent as disposable commodities. Jim Crockett Jr. tried to save the NWA by buying up territories and going national himself. But he ran out of money and was forced to sell to Ted Turner in 1988. The alliance that had controlled professional wrestling for 40 years was reduced to a name on a piece of paper, and eventually even that piece of paper would be sold off, traded around and turned into something unrecognizable. It all traces back to 1975, to the year the honest promoter walked away, to the year the champion burned out, to the year the first national competitor was crushed instead of learned from, to the year the territories started to fracture from within, to the year the technology started changing and nobody in charge noticed or cared. The National Wrestling Alliance did not die in 1975, but it started dying. The diagnosis just had not been made yet. The patient was still walking around, still looking strong on the outside, still throwing its weight around like it would live forever. But the disease was already in the bloodstream, already spreading, already doing its quiet, invisible work. And by the time anyone realized how sick the patient really was, it was too late to save it. That's the story of the NWA in 1975. Not a single dramatic collapse, but a slow accumulation of failures, blind spots, and missed opportunities that turned the most powerful organization in wrestling history into a cautionary tale about what happens when you're too busy protecting what you have to prepare for what's coming. The territories thought they were invincible. They thought the system would last forever. They thought that as long as they controlled the arenas, the television, the talent, and the championships, nothing could touch them. They were wrong. And 1975 was the year the evidence started piling up. They just chose not to see it. Like and subscribe for more deep dives into wrestling history. Until next time.